The wind was sharp that night, cutting through the narrow streets as Daniel walked home with his collar turned up against the cold. Streetlights flickered in the distance, and the sound of his footsteps echoed in the near silence. It was late, the kind of late when the city felt almost abandoned. He took a shortcut through a dim alley, wanting to get home quickly, when he heard something faint, almost too soft for the ear to catch. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, but then it came again, a fragile voice, trembling, carrying a weight of despair that made him stop in his tracks. His eyes scanned the shadows until he saw her, a young woman curled up against a brick wall, hugging her knees as though she could make herself disappear. Her clothes were worn, her hair tangled from the wind, and her face was pale, but it was her eyes that held him there. Eyes that looked as if they'd seen too much pain in too little time. He approached slowly, unsure if she would want him near, unsure if she might run away. She lifted her head and their eyes met. In that moment, she whispered something that made his chest tighten. "I have nowhere to sleep." The words were so soft, yet they seemed to echo through the cold night. There was no plea in her voice, no dramatic cry for help, just a quiet statement of fact, as if she had already accepted her fate. Daniel stood there for a few seconds, frozen not from the weather but from the thought of what it meant to have no place to go. He thought of his own apartment, small, maybe a little messy, but warm. He thought of his bed with its heavy blanket, and the heater that hummed quietly in the corner, and then he looked at her again, sitting in the freezing air with nothing but the thin fabric of her jacket to protect her. He asked her name and she hesitated before answering. "Lena." Her voice cracked slightly, as if even speaking required effort. She told him she had been evicted from her apartment 2 days ago. She had tried the shelter, but there had been no space. Since then she had been walking aimlessly, sleeping wherever she could. Doorsteps, bus stops, anywhere with at least some cover from the wind. He could hear the exhaustion in her tone, could see the way her hands trembled, not just from cold but from pure fatigue. Daniel didn't know her story beyond what she'd just said, but something inside him refused to let him walk away. The alley felt colder with every passing moment, and he could see her lips losing their color. He glanced at the empty street, then back at her, and made a decision before doubt could creep in. "Come with me," he said, his voice steady but gentle. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right, and he repeated it. He wasn't sure if she trusted him, but she stood up slowly, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. They walked together, quietly, the crunch of their footsteps on the frosty pavement the only sound between them. The city felt different now, as if the silence wasn't just around them, but inside them too. Daniel kept glancing at her from the corner of his eye, noticing the way her head hung slightly forward, like the weight of the last few days was pressing down on her shoulders. He didn't ask questions, he didn't need to know everything right now. All he knew was that there was someone beside him who had nowhere to go, and that was enough reason for him to keep walking toward home. When they reached his building, the light from the hallway cast a warm glow on her face. It was faint, but he could see the surprise in her expression, as if she hadn't expected to actually be brought inside anywhere tonight. He unlocked his door and stepped aside, letting her enter first. The warmth of the apartment hit instantly, the faint smell of coffee lingering from earlier in the evening. She paused by the door, hesitant, as though crossing the threshold might be breaking some unspoken rule of her world now. He gave her a reassuring nod, and she stepped in. That night had started as nothing more than a routine walk home for Daniel, but in those few moments, hearing her voice, seeing her shiver, everything shifted. He didn't know what would come next, didn't know if she would stay or if she would disappear in the morning. But as he closed the door behind them, he knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to be out in the cold tonight. Daniel moved toward the small kitchen, the warmth from the heater beginning to soften the stiffness in his fingers. He glanced back at Lena, who stood near the doorway, her arms still folded tightly across her chest as if she were afraid that letting go might make her crumble. She didn't move farther inside, her eyes scanning the room with caution, as though she was stepping into a life that no longer belonged to her. Without saying much, Daniel reached for the kettle, filled it with water, and set it on the stove. The faint hiss of the burner filled the silence. After a moment he turned to her. "You can sit," he said gently, gesturing toward the chair closest to the heater. She hesitated, glancing at the chair like it was too much of a luxury to take, then slowly lowered herself into it. He could see the way she held her mug when he handed her tea a few minutes later, both hands wrapped around it, soaking in the heat as if it might thaw her from the inside out. She took a sip without lifting her eyes from the cup, and for a while neither of them spoke. Daniel wasn't the type to invite strangers into his home. He wasn't reckless, and he had always been careful about letting people get too close. But as he looked at Lena, her shoulders hunched, her lips pale, her breathing uneven, he felt something beyond logic, a quiet urgency that told him she needed this moment of safety. He could see the exhaustion in every part of her. Her hair fell into her face, uncombed, and there was a faint shadow under her eyes, the kind that came from nights without proper rest. She had said she'd been walking, but he knew it was more than that. She had been surviving, moving without knowing where she would end up next, holding on to whatever small fragments of strength she could find. When he asked her what had happened, her story came out in broken pieces. She had lost her job 3 months ago when the small cafe she worked at shut down. Rent had piled up faster than she could manage, and soon the landlord had given her a notice. Friends had promised to help, but their lives were already stretched thin. Family wasn't an option. She spoke of them in a way that made Daniel understand they were either gone or had long closed the door on her. The shelters in the area were full, and the streets had become her only option. She had been trying to keep her head down, to avoid the wrong kind of attention. But the cold was relentless, and tonight she had reached her limit. Daniel listened without interrupting, his hands wrapped around his own mug, though the tea inside had already gone cold. He wasn't sure what to say that wouldn't sound hollow. Words couldn't fix the fact that she had nowhere to go. He thought about offering money, but he knew that wasn't what she needed most at this moment. She needed a space to rest, even if just for tonight. She seemed embarrassed to even be there, her eyes flicking toward the door as if she might leave at a moment. Daniel sensed it, and so he spoke with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "You can stay here tonight," he said. Her eyes widened slightly and she started to shake her head, mumbling something about not wanting to trouble him, but he cut her off softly. "It's not trouble." There was a quiet finality in his tone, as though the decision had already been made and nothing she said could change it. Lena's gaze lingered on him for a moment, searching for something, maybe sincerity, maybe an unspoken condition, but all she found was the steady calm in his expression. Slowly, she gave a small nod, her shoulders relaxing just enough for him to see the first crack in her guarded posture. She didn't smile, not yet, but there was a flicker of relief in her eyes, the kind that comes when a person realizes they can stop fighting for just a little while. That night wasn't about grand gestures or promises of forever. It was about the quiet act of someone seeing another human being in pain and choosing not to look away. Daniel didn't know her well, didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in that small apartment, with the heater humming and the tea cooling between them, a fragile trust began to form. It was enough to make the night feel a little less cold. Daniel disappeared into his bedroom for a moment, pulling back the blanket on his bed and straightening the pillow. The room wasn't big, just enough space for the bed, a small desk and a dresser, but it was warm and smelled faintly of the lavender detergent he used for his sheets. He returned to the living room and found Lena still sitting in the same chair, holding her empty mug, as if unsure what to do next. She looked up when he spoke, his voice calm but certain. "You can sleep in my room tonight." Her eyes widened immediately, and she shook her head. "No, I can't take your bed," she said quickly, her words almost stumbling over each other. Daniel smiled faintly, the kind of smile that was more about reassurance than amusement. "You can," he replied. "And you will. I'll take the floor." She frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the idea, but he was already pulling a blanket from the closet and setting it down on the couch. "It's settled," he said with finality, as if her protests no longer had space to exist. Lena followed him into the bedroom slowly, her steps hesitant. She paused at the doorway, her gaze cast the neatly made bed like it was a luxury she had forgotten existed. Daniel didn't make a big moment of it. He just pulled the blanket up a little more neatly and stepped aside, giving her space to walk in. She didn't move at first, as though crossing that threshold meant accepting something she didn't feel worthy of, but eventually she stepped forward, her hand brushing lightly against the bedspread as if to test whether it was real. When she finally sat down, Daniel could see her body relaxing in small, almost invisible ways. Her shoulders dropped a little, her fingers loosened their tight grip on the edge of her jacket. She ran her hand across the pillowcase, and there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. He didn't say anything. He just quietly placed the mug from earlier on the nightstand, in case she woke in the middle of the night thirsty, and wished her good night. He left the room and lay down on the floor in the living room, using an old pillow and the thickest blanket he owned. The floor wasn't particularly comfortable, but tonight it felt right. He stared up at the ceiling for a while, listening to the muffled sounds from the bedroom, the soft rustle of sheets, the creak of the mattress as she shifted. There was something deeply grounding in knowing that for this one night, she was safe. It struck him how easy it is for life to unravel. One bad month, one lost job, one unlucky turn, and suddenly, a person's world can shift from a warm home to the cold streets. He thought about how many people probably walked past her without stopping, how easy it would have been for him to do the same. But now, lying there, he couldn't imagine if he had. There was a strange sense of peace in the room, even though they were in separate spaces. He could feel the warmth from the heater, hear the faint ticking sound it made every few minutes. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city continued its restless hum, but inside the apartment there was stillness. He thought about her voice earlier, the way she'd whispered those 6 words. "I have nowhere to sleep." They had sounded so small then, but now they felt like the weight of an entire lifetime. Tonight she had somewhere. As his eyes began to close, Daniel found himself hoping she would rest deeply, that she would wake in the morning feeling at least a little more human again. He didn't think about what tomorrow might require or where she would go next. Tonight wasn't about solutions or long-term plans. Tonight was about giving her a bed, a warm room and the space to breathe without fear. And with that thought he let himself drift into sleep on the floor, comforted by the quiet knowledge that kindness had been the only choice worth making. The pale morning light crept through the thin curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. Daniel stirred first, his back a little stiff from the night on the floor, but the faint hum of the heater still filled the apartment with warmth. For a moment he lay still, listening. From the bedroom came the quiet, steady rhythm of breathing, a sound so calm that he knew Lena was still asleep. He smiled faintly, relieved that she'd been able to rest. Pushing himself up, he folded the blanket he had used and placed it neatly on the couch. He moved quietly toward the kitchen, not wanting to wake her, and put the kettle on for coffee. The smell began to fill the air, mingling with the soft light of morning. As he leaned against the counter, his mind wandered back to the night before. The way she had hesitated at his door, the way her fingers had clung to the warmth of the mug, the way her voice had been almost too quiet to hear. He realized that for her last night wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a reminder that not everyone turned away. When he finally peeked into the bedroom he saw Lena curled under the blanket, her hands clutching the edge as though afraid it might disappear. Her hair was spread across the pillow, and her face looked softer now, free from the strain that had etched itself into her features the night before. There was no sign of the exhaustion in her eyes because for once they were closed in real sleep. Daniel stood there for a moment, not wanting to disturb her, quietly grateful that something so small, giving up his bed, could mean so much to someone else. Eventually she began to stir, her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the light, and when she saw him standing there she blinked as if unsure where she was for a moment. Then it came back to her and her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. It wasn't the kind of smile born from joy or comfort. It was the kind that comes from relief, from realizing you've made it through the night and found yourself in a safe place. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," Daniel replied, stepping back to give her space. "There's coffee if you want some." She nodded and sat up slowly, the blanket still draped over her shoulders. For a moment she just sat there, her gaze roaming the small room as if memorizing it, holding on to the feeling of warmth before she had to face the cold again. They didn't speak much over coffee. There was no need for grand conversations or promises. He didn't ask what she would do next, and she didn't offer the details. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when words aren't as important as the simple fact of being there. When she finally stood to leave, Lena paused at the door, looking at him in a way that made him feel like she was trying to say more than she could find words for. "Thank you," she said quietly. 2 words, but they carried the weight of everything she couldn't explain. Daniel just nodded. Not because the moment didn't matter, but because it mattered too much for anything else. As she stepped out into the morning air, the world outside seemed just as cold and uncertain as it had the night before, but she carried something with her now, a memory of kindness, a reminder that there were still people who would give up their own comfort so someone else could feel safe. Daniel watched her walk away until she turned the corner, then closed the door gently. He knew he might never see her again, but that night, those hours of warmth and trust, would stay with him. It wasn't about changing her life in a single moment. It was about making sure that in one of her hardest nights, she didn't face the darkness alone. And in that quiet apartment, Daniel felt the unshakable truth settle in his chest. Sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could leave the deepest mark.